Recently, I demonstrated that Mathew Franklin Whittier had this habit of putting his different pieces together on the page, arranging with his editors to do that, or sometimes taking a poem that he particularly liked and arranging for it to be placed above or below one of his own pieces so that one piece, say the poem on top, would inform you about what the one below was secretly about, the secret message that was in it. A lot of times it had to do with his late wife, Abby, not always. And yesterday, when I shared the story about Deacon Goodman, the man who would sing at meeting, it kept bothering me afterwards. It kind of took a long time for it to percolate up to my conscious mind. But, did you check? Did you check to see if there was a poem, above or below that story? Because it contained a very clear tribute to Abby when she was a girl as a musical prodigy. So logically, one would expect that if he was ever going to pull that little trick, he would do it on this occasion. Well, I looked, and the one above is probably something that the conservative editor chose. It's kind of a paean to Manifest Destiny, which Mathew would not have trucked with. But the one below is a pretty good candidate. I can't say for sure, but I would have to say that this is something that Mathew arranged to be there. So you have the whole story about Deacon Goodman and about Abby as a little girl. She's called Little Mary, and I didn't mention before that Abby had written about Mary twice. She'd written two different stories about Mary, actually three, now that I think of it. So Abby was Catholic, or at least raised Catholic. and so Mathew probably used Little Mary because she had written characters named Mary. Mathew basically never wasted any verbiage. There's nothing that isn't meaningful in his stories. I mean, so it's a very rich field for study. Anyway, so this poem, which is untitled and unsigned, is introduced as follows by Mathew. He says, "The speakers here are a dying girl and her lover. The ardent passion manifested by the youth suggests to the girl several images under which she supposes that he will delight to personify her after her death. The stanzas are in the form of a dialogue, the girl suggesting the particular images in succession and the lover responding." So to go back to the historical Abby poem, I know that she loved the stars and that she thought of herself and Mathew as twin stars. I can establish that now. For a long time, it was speculation on my part, but I was able to substantiate it. So we know that. And then we also know that she loved flowers and she loved songbirds. Well, that's pretty generic, the other two. So I don't think that Mathew wrote this poem. I think he found it and it made him think of Abby, and he wanted to put something under here as a sign that the preceding story really was about Abby as a little girl, as a musical prodigy. So first she says, "Would you think of me as a flower?" And he goes on for the reasons that he wouldn't, that that's not adequate, because flowers are temporary and they fade and so forth and so on. And then the second one is even as a star. And he says, well, they get covered by the clouds and they disappear during the day and so on. So that's not good enough, and then even as a dove. So we have all of Abby's favorite things in here. And he says, "No, my most faithful, be not as a rock. It mocks the embracing wave or stands alone in loveless gloom," and so forth and so on. So a rock stands for steadfastness and faithfulness, but there's problems with thinking of her as a rock. And then finally she says, "Even as myself," and that's the one he likes. He says, "My soul's best idol." Now, when Mathew would praise Abby, this is in her short stories and in one of his poems, both. So we've got it triangulated between one of each of their pieces. when he would praise her, she would say that was idolatry. And he would come back saying that he was a happy idolater, that he admitted it and that he idolized her, see? So that was a little, back and forth between them. So he says, I'm not saying that Matthew wrote this, but I'm saying he would have definitely identified with it. He could have, conceivably. My soul's best idol, be but as thyself, brighter than star, fairer than flower, purer than dove, and in thy spirit's power, steadier than rock. Yes, be thyself, thyself, only thyself. So we don't know. Matthew could have written it. He wrote dialogues. He wrote letters in verse and dialogues and, all of these things. And he would mix and match genres like that. So it would be typical of him to mix a dialogue with verse. But in any case, I would say that was another instance of Matthew writing about Abby and then following it immediately with a poem which tells us or tells posterity, I'm not sure who he was targeting, see, probably both. He says that was Abby in that story, just to confirm it. Now, there's something else I wanted to touch on briefly by way of tying up loose ends. On the 4th, the entry of the 4th, I talked about a pseudonym, Caleb Leathers, which I had long thought was Matthew's based on style, until I ran across a new one, new for me, in which he goes on at some length about having been schoolmates with a Mr. Carter, who was the editor at that time of the Advertiser in Portland, Maine. And but the problem is that he says that he was born in Waterford, Maine, while he was born in Bridgeton, Maine, according to the biographical sketches. But that's very close. It's like 10 miles away. So Leathers is correct about that. But he doesn't say he knows that Carter was born there. He thinks Carter was born there. And Leathers says that that's where he attended a carnival where he saw an elephant for the first time. Well, seeing the elephant was a colloquialism that Matthew loved and used many times. So even here we have some pointers that suggest Matthew's authorship of Caleb Leathers. But the problem is that if this is autobiographical, and we already have a couple biography problems with Caleb Leathers, he's supposed to be a farmer in Vermont, and he's supposed to be conservative, a loco-foco who is kind of on the liberal end of the conservatives. But this is a kind of a conservative Vermont farmer, see, which Matthew obviously was not at this time. He was living in Portland and he was a flaming liberal. So I know that Matthew would adopt characters, so it was possible. But now we get into this business of Caleb Leathers having been schoolmates with Mr. Carter, So what's up with that? Well, I traced it as far as I could go. This was the Honorable Henry Carter, who not only was an editor of the Advertiser in Portland, but also a judge. He was born, as I said, in Bridgeton, Maine, which is, over 100 miles from Haverhill, Massachusetts, where Matthew was born and raised. And that would seem to be the end of it, except that after 10 years of living in Portland, he moved to Bradford, Massachusetts, which at that time was part of Haverhill. In other words, he moved to Matthew's hometown. And in that hometown, according to the Haverhill Public Library, is the Carter House. And the Carter House is in Gothic Revival architecture style, which means it goes way back to probably back to or before Henry Carter's birth. And I think it was 1814. He's 2 years younger than Matthew. Now, there's still some problems because that description has young Henry Carter not reading, but reciting from memory a passage about Napoleon when Leathers says that he was just learning to read. Well, Matthew, as one of the Whittier brothers, would have learned to read from the time he could walk, basically. So that doesn't quite fit. It does fit that Carter had more resources, more access to books than Matthew did, because in Matthew's household, there was maybe 30 books max, 2 shelves worth of books. So there's already some problems in there. But if the Carter home, which Henry Carter moved to and retired to in Bradford, was part of his extended family, if that was his grandparents' house, say, or an aunt's house or an uncle's house, That would mean that during the winter, he could have gone there to visit. And winter is when one-room schoolhouses in rural areas were in operation because they only had school during the winter months when there was no farming. If he visited his grandparents in Bradford, which was Haverhill at the time, and went to school, he probably would have gone to the one-room schoolhouse that the Whittier brothers attended. So now there's a couple different ways of getting to that. If we can find Henry Carter in a memoir saying, I went to school with the poet Whittier, see, because he wouldn't have mentioned Mathew, but he would have mentioned John Greenleaf Whittier if he'd gone to school with him for any, like even once or twice. That could be in the historical record. Just to find out that the Carter home in Bradford actually was owned by a member of his extended family would bring it closer. So I've written to the library, if I can find that Henry Carter did in fact visit the Carter home in Bradford when he was a boy, that means he, for any length of time, he would have attended the one-room schoolhouse that Mathew attended, and Mathew would in fact have been schoolmates with him. See? So we can't cut out Caleb Leathers quite yet. If that turns out to be Mathew, what it simply means is that Mathew would go further than I have generally suspected him of doing in creating a character. You know, here he is, a radical living in Portland, and he's writing as a Vermont farmer who's a locofoco. See, that would be typical of him. I've seen him do this many times, but one notable one that comes to mind, in 1856 and 1857, he wrote a travelogue for the same newspaper, the Portland Transcript, as J-O-B, initials. You know, it's Job, but the initials are J period, O period, B period. And it's very clear from style that that's Mathew until he goes on his European trip in July of 1851, at which time he apparently hands off the column to somebody else, who then writes about how he had, you know, a sister that died and everything, which none of which would fit Mathew. See, suddenly it becomes totally off target for Mathew. So apparently, just like TV shows are written by different people in different seasons, apparently a travelogue writer, when he had a popular travelogue, rather than to end it when he left, it would get handed off to somebody else. I found 2 or 3 instances of this happening in Mathew's work. I've never read about this. I'm just extrapolating it from, you know, what I've seen in Mathew's work. So in 1856, Mathew introduces himself as a student living in an attic who wants to go on a trip because he wants to take a break from his studies. Well, technically, Mathew is a student of life. He lives in an attic and he studies hard all his life and stays up late, see? So in a sense, it's true, but the clear inference is that he's like a 20-year-old kid, which he clearly isn't. But then when Job goes on another trip and reappears the following year in 1857, all of a sudden he's a married man with a family who's living in rural Maine and who wants to go move to Detroit. So he grew up awful fast if he was a 20-year-old or 18-year-old student the previous year, see? Got married, had children, and became middle-aged in a whole year. So that simply proves that Mathew would adopt these personas which were not, you know, strictly speaking, true to life. That means that Caleb Leathers could be Mathew, pretending to be a Vermont farmer who's a locofoco. So if the Haverhill Public Library writes me back, which they've been pretty good to me in the past, and has any information which ties the Honorable Henry Carter to the Carter house, you know, and indicates that he could indeed or did visit, and that he did indeed go to school with the poet Whittier, you know, then we'll have it. Then I have to go back and reinstate Caleb Leathers into my books, you know, where I've taken him out. So that's just a little follow-up on some of the things I've talked about recently. Things continue to be very quiet still. I'm kind of over it now as far as worrying about that. They do tend to go up and down in waves, you know. So all the people who are interested in me have kind of died out, and then there'll be a period of a lull, and then maybe some new people will discover me and express some interest, and then it'll go back up again. So in the meantime, I'll just hang loose and continue with the work I have here. And if something comes to mind that I think is interesting, I will get back on the camera.